Dante approached the upper rock, which now, without any support, leaned towards the sea. The intrepid treasure-seeker walked around it, and, selecting the spot from whence it appeared most susceptible to attack, placed his lever in one of the crevices, and strained every nerve to move the mass. The rock, already shaken by the explosion, tottered on its base. Dante redoubled his efforts. He seemed like one of the ancient titans who uprooted the mountains to hurl against the father of the gods. The rock yielded, rolled over, bounded from point to point, and finally disappeared in the ocean. On the spot it had occupied was a circular space, exposing an iron ring let into a square flagstone. Dante uttered a cry of joy and surprise. Never had a first attempt been crowned with more perfect success. He would fain have continued, but his knees trembled, and his heart beat so violently, and his sight became so dim, that he was forced to pause. This feeling lasted but for a moment. Edmond inserted his lever in the ring and exerted all of his strength. The flagstone yielded, and disclosed steps that descended until they were lost in the obscurity of the subterraneous grotto. Anyone else would have rushed on with a cry of joy. Dante turned pale, hesitated, and reflected. "Come," he said to himself, "be a man. I am accustomed to adversity. I must not be cast down by the discovery that I have been deceived. What, then, would be the use of all I have suffered? The heart breaks when, after having been elated by flattering hopes, it sees all its illusions destroyed. Faria had dreamed this. The Cardinal Spada buried the treasure here. Perhaps he never came here, or if he did, Caesar Borgia, the intrepid adventurer, the stealthy and indefatigable plunderer, has followed him, discovered his traces, pursued them as I have done, raised the stone, and descending before me, has left nothing." Okay, I'm not going to go into what I went into yesterday, but indefatigable is a hard word to say. I ask you, listening, just pause a moment and try to say that a few times. Indefatigable. I could relate to Dante here. There's a moment in life, it doesn't come very often, when you are so overwhelmed by an experience that, at least for me, I have experienced a kind of like dizzying effect. You are laughing so hard at something, and the joy is so overcoming that you get a little lightheaded. Things get a little blurry, and you have to like pause for a moment to collect yourself. I have been there. And likewise, getting like this really tapped. Okay, this is going to date me. I recognize that, but I'm going to say it anyway. There is a sort of like, to a more superficial degree, when you are a child and you get a present for Christmas or a holiday, your birthday, that you really, really wanted and you didn't think it was ever possible you would get. You know, for me, getting my first Nintendo system in 1989, I think it was, maybe 1990, but I think it was 89, where it's just something you've wanted for so long, and it represents a sort of life you think you could never have. You know, I'm thinking also of like getting your first bike, getting your first car. There's just an overwhelming sense of joy and sense of experience that almost has a physical sensation on you. Now, for Dante, it's a little bit even more than that, right? He has a much more layered experience because not only is he experiencing that, but he also has, I wouldn't call it self-doubt, but he does have like a pendulum going back and forth in his head of emotions where he is uncovering evidence that this could all be true, but he's been so traumatized and damaged by his experience of, let's just tie it in. Dumas doesn't do this, but I do think it is part of the tapestry he's intending here, where very early in the book, Dante's suspicion was voiced of, it doesn't seem right that one man should receive so much happiness without some sort of struggle. He says that before he's imprisoned, right before his wedding, and then almost as if the fate is like, yeah, you're right, that isn't true, and that isn't fair, and you're going to suffer. And everything is taken away from him. I think he's maybe experiencing that same thing here, where he's like, oh my God, I'm about to become an incredibly wealthy man. Everything Faria said was true, but I don't know. I've been burned on this before. I gotta just sit and think. I can't get my hopes up too much because I don't want to experience what he says here, The heart breaks after having been elated by flattering hopes. It sees all of its illusions destroyed. A certain kind of heartbreak when your hopes are just dashed on the rocks of the shore. He is trying to protect himself from that again. And he tries to convince himself that even if it is true, that maybe Spada didn't bury any treasure here. Or if he did, that Caesar Borgia, in the story that Faria told, had actually discovered all of the treasure, and there's nothing left inside. And Dante is maybe plagued a little bit by the dream he had of taking all the jewels out and them turning to pebbles. And then I think on a more basic level, Dumas is using this as a way to kind of continue the suspense. There's always that hint of doubt that it couldn't possibly be what you think it is. So we have to keep reading to figure out whether or not it's true. Because if Dante, as he even says here, that anyone else would have rushed on in a cry of joy, like if that were the case, if that's what Dante was doing, if he just saw the stairway, the descent here, and just rushed in headlong, like it wouldn't be as suspenseful. That's what the old Dante probably would have done. In fact, that kind of gives that sentence a new perspective, doesn't it? Anyone else would have rushed on with a cry of joy. That is kind of it's simultaneously Dumas telling us a story as readers and him as the author, but it's also kind of putting us in Dante's frame of mind in that Dante doesn't quite recognize his previous self anymore. Or maybe he does, and he's actively stepping away from it by turning pale, hesitated, and reflecting. You know, Dante turned pale, hesitated, and reflected. So I guess maybe sidestepping the speculation of what Dumas is or is not intending here, I'll just state that I'm surprised at the depth of psychology that Dumas is employing in Dante long before psychological practices and theories were known or even accepted. I mean, this is before Freud, so all of that Freudian analysis we did, it was kind of, superfluous. But Dumas isn't just telling us a story. He's telling us Dante's story through Dante's point of view. Yes, he breaks out into, breaking the fourth wall every now and then, and he steps away from Dante every now and then to give us further context for the story. But like, as I talked about last chapter with the more modern way of writing, the more simple sentences, the less poetic and flowery way of writing, I feel like this would just be a kind of detached style of writing of him going down the stairwell and figuring out what's down there without this moment of hesitation and internal psychology that is reflecting on everything that's come before it. Like, I'm not saying that modern writing doesn't have a psychological edge to it. It certainly does. But this is using every single part of what Dumas has established up until now in order to give us a more acute emotional experience in the moment. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. And I promise I'm not going to end every episode this chapter with a complete deflation of what I say. It's just my insecurities coming to the surface. So why don't we continue? We're in the smack center of chapter 24. We'll continue tomorrow with even more of it. So join me here then, won't you? Okay, goodbye. The Countdown of Monte Cristo is part of the Gruntwork Podcast Network. This show is produced, edited, and hosted by Landon Solano. The original text of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Theme song by Magic Solo. If you want to support the show and others like it, visit patreon.com/gruntworkpod. Thank you for listening. See you tomorrow.